job. All right. So
Thank you. Well, he took my joke. I was going to say, I wonder why I'm the one teaching Esther. But yeah, I guess he wanted a female up here. Thank you. Thanks, Trey. Well, I hope everyone's having a good week so far. I have a very unique perspective on Esther. As a female, I think we all grow up with a really unique picture of Esther, right? And I think it's a glamorous story from what I remember growing up and hearing about it. And then I went off to Bible college, and they ripped that perspective right from me. And so tonight, I texted my dad earlier in this week, and I gave him some terms. I said, am I allowed to use this from the pulpit? He's like, no. So I'm going to debunk what some of you might think about the book of Esther, and I'm going to do it in a very, not that it was anything crude or anything like that, but some modern words that I probably shouldn't use. So I'm going to delve into Esther and see if it changes anyone's thoughts about it. And then it's only 8 chapters. I kind of break it up into sections of how I view the storyline. And so first, Jace can go ahead and put it up there because I'm not reading scripture yet, but we'll get to chapter 1 in a second. So first, context of Esther. Jensen talked last week about Ezra and Nehemiah, and that kind of focuses on the exile, right? So Esther, people believe that the story of Esther falls between the book of Ezra chapter 6 and 7. It's said that there's a 60-year gap in the story. Jensen, do you think that's true? The scholar who taught on Ezra thinks it's true, so that's good enough for me. I actually just went up to Jensen to ask him how to pronounce a name that I'm about to read in scripture, but he didn't know the answer to that one, so he's not flawless, just so everyone in the room knows. But Esther is believed to fall between chapter 6 and 7 in the book of Ezra. So we're talking about King Xerxes still. And during this time, some Jews still had not returned. Well, some Jews, returned to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel and Ezra, but Esther and her family had not. So they're dispersed throughout Persia. And King Xerxes the first is the king of Persia at the time. In the Bible, he's referred to, and hence the name that neither Jensen or I know how to pronounce, King Ahasuerus. And so that's the king, but it is King Xerxes. And so basically the names are interchangeable. It's just different language forms. So Esther, in the Hebrew translation, Xerxes is Ahasuerus. So when we read Esther and that A name pops up, I'm probably just going to say King Xerxes, just so you all know, okay? So the two are interchangeable. We're talking about the same king that we talked about last week. And so Esther is essentially a continuation of these narrative books. Following? Makes sense. So that's setting the scene for where we're at. So chapter 1, I like to call this the chapter where the queen is dethroned. Dun, dun, dun. So King Xerxes is throwing this big old banquet. All of the political leaders are in there, and the wives are in a different room. This just happened on a Saturday in section 9, did it not? All the men were out here voting, and I heard all the women went to a different room. They got gifts and hung out, right? So it's still happening today. They put the women in the back. They get to have a party, and the men stay out here, and they do all the boring political stuff. Well, in this story, the Persian king and the Persian political powers are getting very drunk, and they're drinking a ton. So they're having this banquet, and on the last day, the Bible's words, it's King Xerxes orders his wife, Queen Vashti, to be brought into the banquet to display her beauty to the attendees. So the Bible does say order. So this was not a request, right? It was the king saying, get out here because I want all my guests to see your beauty. Well, Queen Vashti ends up rejecting his request, likely denying it because it would have been degrading. He essentially wanted to parade her in front of a drunk audience who would do nothing but lust after her looks. And so the king ends up looking to the officials at the banquet for advice on how to address her disobedience. And the king's company felt that her actions would cause their wives to follow suit and behave similarly to their husbands, as in disobey them. So the king took away the queen's title and chose to choose another wife. dramatic. But that's really just, the Bible paints this picture, right? So the queen's like, I'm not doing that. I don't blame her. And now all of a sudden the men are like, well, she's out there in the banquet hall with all the wives, and she's telling you no. So now all the other women are going to think they can say no, and that's unacceptable. So they decide to make an example out of her, and the queen is dethroned. That's chapter 1 of Esther. Great start, great character we see in King Xerxes. And so it kind of, but truly, I do want to note this is the man we're dealing with, right? So I can't make too many assumptions about the kind of people in the Bible, right? We're very limited what we have, but I don't have a good impression of him from chapter 1. I don't. And so now we're going to move into chapter 2, or what I like to call the beauty pageant. But we're actually going to look straight to Scripture, Jace, so I'm going to read verses 2 through 4 of Esther chapter 2. Jace is going to have his hands full back there. I'm sorry. And so Esther chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, it says, Then the king's attendants who served him said, Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. And may the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and have them bring every beautiful young virgin to the city of Susa, to the harem, and to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti. And the suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. So next we see that Esther is introduced. So Esther is a Jew who, raised by Jews, right? And she had no father or mother. The Bible does not tell us why, but all we see is that she is raised by her cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jew who was scattered throughout Persia from this exile, right? And so he is the one essentially raising Esther. One fun fact about Esther, how many people who can name what her Hebrew name is? Hadassah. I know several women with the name Hadassah, and I think it's beautiful. So Esther's Jewish name was Hadassah. It wasn't uncommon in that time frame for the dispersed Jews to adopt Persian names, I know people today, right, that have to adopt names. So Hadassah, though, is believed in Jewish culture to come from a Hebrew word for myrtle. I found this on 2 different, Jewish forums. Okay, so if it's false, the Jews that are writing these posts have lied to me. But it is believed that it comes from a Hebrew word for myrtle, or a shrub with star-shaped flowers. These flowers represent peace in Jewish history, pulling from an encounter with angels who proclaimed peace next to myrtle trees in Zechariah. So all from that story, the Jews believe that these flowers represent peace. And so they believe that Esther carried out the meaning of her name by bringing peace to the Jews. Just a fun fact. That was for free. Well, another fun fact is Esther was quite beautiful. And we know this because she ended up being taken into the custody of Haggai. But she found favor immediately with Haggai, the keeper of the virgins. So now we'll look to verses 12 through 14. And in these verses, still in chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, we see the pattern of King Xerxes and the women, and it's detailed as follows. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Xerxes after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beauty treatment were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with balsam oil and the cosmetics for women, the young woman would go into the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would enter, and in the morning she would return to the second harem to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. This is the beauty pageant. This is the pageant that as a kid I thought sounded so glamorous. And who all seen the movie One Night with the King? I thought about just playing it for the whole lesson tonight. I thought I might just sit down, have Jace push play, and we'd see how long everyone lasts with, like, when is she teaching? But truly, there's this picture painted in my head when I was growing up of just, like, how glamorous that sounded. 6 months with myrrh, 6 months with oil, all the cosmetics. The movie paints them with the most beautiful dresses. And I think that's true, right? They were trying to paint these virgins to be as beautiful as possible. But the scripture says that in the evening she would enter, and in the morning she would return to the second. Why? How am I saying that word? Harem? Harem? Harem. Okay. So they did not go back to the place they had came, though. Instead, they joined the concubines. Concubines were women who had only sexual or romantic relationships with the king without being a wife. So you have a level of wife, and then you have as many concubines as this king wanted. And sometimes they were used for political reasons, but this story is not telling us that that's the reason, right? And so in modern terms, what this story looks like is A, these women are taken without consent. 2, they had no freedom. And 3, their purpose was to serve the king as he pleased. This is not glamorous. This is rape. This is abduction. This is cruel. And these women would no longer ever have a right to marry. So they're young virgins who might have had dreams in their life, but they're taken in by this king who's probably twice or 3 times their age, and they'll never get to go back to life as they knew it. And now they're joining the palace as a concubine, and not even for any purpose outside of a sexual one, and their name might never get called again, really. And so that's what's going on, and Esther's one of those unfortunate women who had a pretty face and gets to be used at the king's disposal. And so what we see is not a beauty pageant that I would wish for any girl today to be envious of. What we see happening is innocent women being taken by the king, and they'll never be able to choose a life they want, for they're now just nothing but a possession of the king. Well, Esther had her turn. So, right, the Bible said these women were called one at a time, spent a night with the king, and Esther was chosen one evening. When she went into the king, verse 17 tells us that the king loved her more than all of the others, and he made her queen. She won. Well, while this is all happening, Esther's flourishing. She's just been chosen as the king. There's this whole side plot happening in Esther, which is, this story is crazy. But Mordecai, the good guardian he is visiting the gates of the palace regularly, trying to hear about how Esther's doing. It's kind of like reality TV, so like TV show style. You know, you've got all these virgins in a house, and the king's about to choose his next wife. Mordecai's walking outside of the palace, like, how's Esther? How's she doing? How's she looking? What month of her treatments is she on? And he's visiting the palace, and he ends up hearing of a plan to harm the king. And so we're going to read verses 21 through 23. It says, in those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, there's so many names I cannot pronounce. Forgive me. You guys all would be struggling too if you're in my shoes. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, I'm going to have you guys do this. Yeah, okay. What Trey said. And who wants the second one? There we go. 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he informed Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. Then when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on wooden gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. And so chapter 2 ends. So we saw Esther become queen. We saw Mordecai save the king. His name gets written down in history books. And then the story just moves along to chapters 3 and 4, which I am calling Haman's schemes. So the story is really just now beginning, but a lot's already happened. And now we see a new character come in, and his name is Haman. So this chapter opens up with the king honoring and exalting Haman to a higher position of authority. The Bible paints him to be a pretty prideful man because immediately he does not take a liking to Mordecai, right? So Haman's walking around and everyone's supposed to bow to him except this one Jew, Mordecai, won't bow. And when Haman finds out it's because Mordecai is a Jew and will not bow to any man, Haman is filled with rage and a desire to kill all Jews throughout the entire kingdom. Well, he ends up going to the king and convincing him that the Jews are a problem to his kingdom. Also, this king just seems very easily influenced. Chapter 1, he's asking all his friends what to do with his wife, and now here he is listening to this Haman dude telling him, this is your problem, and I'll fix it for you. And the king's like, yeah, that sounds good. So he describes the Jews as a group of people who are outsiders, which A is true. They are ripped from their homes. But he's telling the king that because they are outsiders, their laws are different. They're going to become complacent of the laws you have. They're not going to follow your laws. They already aren't. He won't bow to me. And so the king gives him his ring to create whatever decree he pleases. So the scribes are summoned, the command is given, and the decree is published in every language and given to all people. Has anyone ever seen the original Willy Wonka? And when they're like about to announce the golden ticket, the scene where the scooters run out all across town and they tape it up. There's like a whole scene. It's intense music, and they're spreading the news across the world that there's going to be golden tickets. Well, that's what happened. The Bible spends multiple verses telling us about the spreading of the decree. So it's this big deal. Well, chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. It says, letters were sent by couriers to all of the king's provinces to annihilate, kill and destroy all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, and one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the people so that they would be ready for this day. The couriers went out, speeded by the king's order, while the decree was issued at the city in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was agitated. They're always drinking too, aren't they, those kings? They always go back to drinking. So this decree has been sent, and now the Jews are on this countdown. It's a ticking time bomb before all of a sudden just anyone out there can go kill Jews for no reason and take their possessions and just go killing spree. Well, of course, the Jews begin to fast and weep and mourn. And Esther caught wind of the mourning, so she sent her eunuch to learn from Malachi what was going on. Malachi told him everything, giving him a copy of the decree to take back to Esther. But he also said this. In chapter 3, verse 8, he said, and inform her and order her to go into the king to implore his favor and plead with him for her people. So this is where we see something very heavy, heavier than what we've already talked about, drop onto the scene. Mordecai asks her, go to the king, implore his favor, and plead with him for your people. Esther's response recites the law of the king, that anyone who goes to the king's courts without being summoned will be put to death. Mordecai then delivers perhaps one of the most impactful statements and widely quoted speeches of all time. Chapter 3, verses 12 through 14 says, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, liberation and rescue will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And that caught, and it stuck for Esther, and this was enough. And she requested that all of the Jews be gathered and fast and pray for her. And she agrees to go to the king, saying, if I perish, I perish. This verse teaches me so many different things. I think, firstly, it says, do not imagine that because you are in the palace, you can escape any more than everyone else. So I think it's like a reminder for us that no matter how highly exalted you are never above reproach. You are never above the lowly things, right? We will never truly be higher than anyone else. God's created us with the same potential, the same purpose, the same worth, and same inherent value. And so there is never going to be a position so high that you're above what everyone else is. And then it says, if you keep silent, rescue will come from somewhere else, and your house will perish. That's a concept throughout the Bible, right? If you don't step up to the plate, God will use someone else. His will happen with or without us. I wouldn't dare think that Jerica, I almost said Breedlove, Bowman, is so important that I would jeopardize God's plan by not being compliant. No, God will deliver his plan and his will no matter what. But why not let it come through me, right? Why not let it be through my willingness to serve that something good could happen? And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? I think about there's people that credit everything to God. You know, they're like Sonic had a buy one, get one free. I didn't even know that. I got a second burger today for free. That was God. Sonic has buy one, get one free every Tuesday. Like, that wasn't God. This was destined. It was predetermined. Last week, they decided it would keep happening this week. But why not credit it to God? And why not think that you are royalty because of God? And so whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this, we never know how things have aligned. We'll never know if this was God or not. We won't. But why not try to choose that it was? Why not try to live that it was? And for Esther, I absolutely think this was God, right? This was God's will for her life. A Jew disguised as a queen for when the Jews are ordered to be killed, that was God. And so Esther said, if I perish, I perish. I also see this nobility in her. And it's like, it's a quality in a leader that's willing to put your needs below everyone else's, your life below the worth of others. And I think that's the life as a Christian, right? What would we have to lay down for others to flourish, to preach the gospel, to make sure that other people get to hear this gospel, that not to safeguard it, right, but to lay down. And if I perish, but that person's going to know about God. And so chapters 3 through 4, we see Haman's schemes. And now we go into chapters 5 through 7 that I like to call party planning. Back to those parties that us females love to throw. So we see now that Esther approaches the king for the first time in his inner courtyard, where no one dare enter without being summoned. However, he meets her with favor and invitation rather than the punishment she is due by law. I can almost remember being a kid. I also think when I was younger, growing up in church, I think I read Esther and Ruth more than any other book in the Bible. You know, I'm just this girl reading the Bible, and like, if these women have books, like, I'm going to keep reading these. That's cool. And so I can almost remember reading Esther, and you go from chapter 4, right, where Esther agrees, I will go before the king, and I think I'm probably going to die. And then the immediate next chapter, she goes to the king. I thought that's when she was going to ask, will you save the Jews? And it's like, that's the cliffhanger. But she just asks him, can you come to my banquet? And I remember being confused, like, Esther, you're supposed to be asking him to save your people. What are you doing? There's no time for a banquet. Like, get to it. But she was very tactful. And I think that's so important to notice, right? This was a very smart woman. I think God was using her in every detail. And she knew. What did I just say earlier? The king likes to drink. Esther knew what she was doing, but she was tactful. And so she braved the moment of walking into his courtyard, punishable by death, to invite him to her banquet. He meets her with favor rather than punishment, and he agrees to join, and she also invites Haman, and he agrees to join. Haman is so filled with pride, he brags to his whole family about how the queen prepared a banquet just for him and the king. What a high honor. And yet, Mordecai will not bow to him. So he is infuriated and cannot wait for the day of the decree. So he makes plans to request that Mordecai be executed on custom gallows the next day. Well, this was an eventful day. Esther approaches the king, breaking the law, but breathing a sigh of relief when he welcomes her. Haman has gallows built to murder Mordecai. And then on top of all of that, it just so happens the king can't sleep that night. So the Bible tells us in chapter 6 that when he could not sleep, he has the book of records be brought out and read to him. I think that would do the trick for me too, right? Have some boring history books read to you, and that'll help you sleep. Well, all of a sudden, this is how the Bible paints it. So he's literally laying in bed. The history books are being read to him. And then all of a sudden, he hears the story of 2 doorkeepers who had schemed to kill the king, but this man stopped them. And he begins to question, what did he do to honor Mordecai? Like, this man saved my life. I forgot about it. What did I do for him? And they tell him you did nothing. Well, Haman's also walking in the courtyard at that very hour to request that Mordecai be hung. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, like, the king is laying in bed. How do I honor Mordecai? And Haman's walking up about to ask him, can I kill Mordecai? And so the king invites Haman in. He knocks on the door, and he says, how would you honor someone who you can't even describe what he's done for you? And Haman fills with pride and tells him everything that his heart would desire, the showers and the riches that he wants. And as soon as he lays it all out, everything that he would wish for, the king says, that's what I want to do for Mordecai. And this all kind of closes out, and we all of a sudden just get back to the banquet that Esther has planned. So Haman and the king go to drink and dine with Esther. And what happens in chapter 7 is so pivotal and fast-paced, I almost just wanted to read it word for word. So let's look at verse 3, the point of this story that everything is led to. So this whole thing is kind of led to this pivotal moment where she's about to give her request to the king. Starting in verse 3, and I'm about to read a lot of scripture, so bear with me. But it's going to lay out the whole story of Esther, basically. Then King Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given as my request and my people as my wish. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, killed, and eliminated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have kept silent, because the distress would not be sufficient reason to burden you. Then King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who would presume to do such a thing? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Verse 7, the king then got up in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they had been drinking, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Pause. The Bible did tell us earlier in the story. We don't know anything. I don't know what love Esther might have or didn't feel towards the king. I would think she was probably trying to make the best of the situation. But the Bible does tell us that he felt a love for Esther. So whether or not he treated her well in modern day terms, he loved her. We see that because he extended grace when she was punishable by death for breaking law. And so this is his prized possession, his queen. And now Haman is A, Esther saying trying to kill her people, and B, throwing himself on her in the living room. And so they cover his face. Verse 9. Then one of the eunuchs who stood before the king said, indeed, behold, Haman built wooden gallows standing 50 cubits high, and he made it for Mordecai, who spoke good in behalf of the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the wooden gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. And that brings us to chapter 8, or what I like to call the curtain call. So again, that moved very fast. It's very fast paced. It kind of wraps up really quickly. But the timing is impeccable, and that's why I can't help but think this, or know that this was God's hand, right? And so everything just aligned in a way for Esther to be able to petition the king and to find favor with him and to paint Haman and expose him for the wickedness that he was. The ring that was on Haman's hand is placed on Mordecai's, exalting him to a high place of authority. A new decree is sent out, encouraging the Jews to defend themselves. In the last 2 verses of the whole book of Esther, it says, "For the Jews there was light, joy, jubilation, and honor. In each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was joy and jubilation for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews because the dread of the Jews had fallen on them." Revival. There was revival. There was celebration. It's the happy ending. The curtain falls and everyone stands on their feet, standing ovation because God came through again. And so, being at Urshan, Professor Runk, there was a whole class called Old Testament Literature, and we went through each book of the Old Testament. And he completely changed my perspective that day. I was 18. I had watched A Night with the King so many times. I thought Esther's life was one of glamour and class. There's even conferences called the Esther Conference. Has anyone in here ever been to one? Yeah, so it's and I'm not saying that's not a good thing, but there's conferences being held telling them that you are royal and you are chosen for such a time as this. And I still agree with all of that, but now for me, 24, studying out a little bit more, being a girl that dreamed of her own husband one day, right? I get to live that out. And realizing everything that Esther sacrificed to put her people's needs above her own. The crown that Esther wore means a whole lot more to me now than it did when I was younger. Her crown has a whole lot more to do with self-restraint, persecution, selflessness, and courage, way more than it has to do with a pretty face. Her path did include glamour and jewels and high fashion, but I bet she would have chosen the comfort of her home rather than going to join the concubines of a man years older than her. The crown and favor she earned from the king couldn't even grant her access to the king. She feared for her life as she walked up to his door to request that he correct something that was sent out in his name. But she looked beyond her own comfort and put the cause of greater good before her own needs. She was a selfless leader, one who knew how to rely on others. She called for the Jews to pray and to fast. She requested prayer, and she looked to God in her time of fear. So great leaders are not higher than asking for prayer, than asking for help, and admitting to being scared. And that is everything that Esther represents to me now. And that's all I got. I only had 8 chapters and 40 minutes, so I don't think I could fill the time.